The present government has a different approach. It seeks to derive its legitimacy directly from the people, bypassing their elected representatives. Since the people have no institutional mechanism for holding governments to account other than Parliament, the effect is that ministers are accountable to nobody except every 5 years at general elections. Within 4 months of the general election, the new government was faced with the coronavirus epidemic. The minutes of the meetings of SAGE, its panel of expert scientific advisors, record that shortly before the lockdown was announced, the behavioral scientists advised against the use of coercive powers. Citizens, they said, should be treated as rational actors capable of taking decisions for themselves and managing personal risk. The government did not act on that advice. Driven by the public panic and the general demand for action, it opted for a course which it believed would make it popular. It chose coercion. For this, it needed statutory powers. There were 3 relevant statutes. The Coronavirus Act was passed specifically to deal with COVID-19. This hefty document of 348 pages with 102 sections and 29 schedules was pushed through all its stages in a single day in each House of Parliament, just as the lockdown was announced. In the time available, no serious scrutiny of its terms can have been possible.
I'm in my uniform, working as a healthcare assistant for the NHS. I don't need the uniform to prove that I work for them, but today I'm publicly resigning, okay? I'm wearing this uniform, sadly, for the last time. I loved my job, okay? I absolutely loved it. Those of you that have been following what's going on, we've done talks, we've organised protests, I've had a lot of flack. I'm at the point now, it's all coming back to me. I've had an email from work last night asking me what's going on. People are reporting me, and unfortunately I can't lie anymore. The email is asking what's going on, and how can I lie? I did something really bad. I took a screenshot on Friday that shows the figures of how many people are in Treliske Hospital with COVID, and I shared it. Because this should be public information, okay? I can tell. I can tell you that on Friday in Treliske there were 3 people in with COVID. No extra deaths, 3. And that covers Treliske, West Cornwall and Hale Hospital. The total deaths from these 3 hospitals in 7 months is 76 people. That's about 10 people a month over the last 7 months, and we have locked down.
The Coronavirus Act was primarily concerned to enlarge the government's powers to marshal the medical resources of the country and to authorise additional public expenditure. But tucked away in Schedules 21 and 22, there were additional powers to control the movements of people. Schedule 21 authorises public health officials to screen and test people for infectious diseases. They are given extensive powers to control the movement of anybody found to be infectious and to call on the police to enforce their directions. Schedule 22 confers on the Secretary of State extensive powers to forbid events or gatherings and to close premises for the purpose of controlling the transmission of COVID-19. For present purposes, however, the important point to note is that apart from the power to prevent events or gatherings, the Act conferred no power to control the lives of healthy people. The measure stood in a long tradition dating back many centuries by which infectious diseases are controlled by the confinement of infectious people and not by the confinement of healthy ones. A power to confine healthy people was, however, conferred by another statute, the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004. The Civil Contingencies Act is the only statute specifically designed for emergencies serious enough to require the kind of measures that we have seen. It authorizes ministers to make regulations to deal with a wide variety of events or situations, including those which, quote, threaten serious damage to human welfare. These are defined so as to include things which may cause loss of life or illness. The regulation power could not be wider. Ministers are authorized to do by regulation anything that Parliament can do by statute, i.e., anything at all.
Lots of people have to start speaking out. There's lots of doctors and nurses that have come forward. They're all on restrictive duties. They're all seeing solicitors, etc. Well, I've decided there's no point. I have gone against the rules within the NHS. I have shared confidential information that people need to see. Shared it because as much as I've always loved our NHS, it's no longer our NHS. It is run by the corrupt government and the other people running this country. Yes! We no longer have healthcare. We can't see dentists, okay? I can tell you now, when I was working at the height of the pandemic, I had no work for 3 weeks because there was no patients, okay? We have a particular COVID ward. None of the wards were overflowing with COVID patients, and they're not now. The mainstream media have filled you with fear.
In Britain, the lockdown was followed by a brief period in which the government's approval ratings were sky high. That is how freedom dies. When societies lose their liberty, it isn't usually because some despot has crushed it under his boot. It is because people voluntarily surrender their liberty out of fear of some external threat. Historically, fear has always been the most potent instrument of the authoritarian state. That is what we are witnessing today. But the fault is not just in our government, it's also in ourselves. Fear provokes strident calls for abrasive action, much of which may be unhelpful or damaging. It promotes intolerant conformism. It encourages abuse directed against anyone who steps out of line, including many responsible opponents of this government's measures and some notable scientists who have questioned their empirical basis. These are the authentic ingredients of a totalitarian society. So I regret to say is another feature of the history, namely the propaganda by which the government has to some extent been able to create its own public opinion. Fear was deliberately stoked up by the government. The language of impending doom, the daily press conferences, the alarmist projections of the mathematical modelers, the manipulative use of selected statistics, the presentation of exceptional tragedies as if they were the normal effects of COVID-19. And above all, the attempt to suggest that COVID-19 was an indiscriminate killer, when the truth was that it killed identifiable groups, notably those with serious underlying conditions and the old, who could and arguably should have been sheltered without coercing the entire population. These exaggerations were not accidental. They followed naturally from the logic of the measures themselves. They were necessary in order to justify the extreme steps which the government had taken and to promote compliance. As a strategy, this was entirely successful. So successful was it that when the government eventually woke up to the damage that it was doing, especially to the economy and to the education of children, it found it difficult to reverse course. The public naturally asked themselves, well, what had changed? The honest answer to that question would have been that nothing much had changed. The threat had just not been fairly presented in the first place.
Some facts. On March the 19th, if you go on the government website, it's still there now. The coronavirus was classed as a non-contagious disease. It's there now. It's a quick Google search, guys. If you think guys, if you think this lockdown is right and is going to do any difference, you're completely wrong. Our economy is going to crash. Small businesses, people are going to starve. You think it's going to be a month? We were flattening the curve back in April, and this was when the disease was supposedly dying out. The lockdowns came out then.
Other governments, in Germany, in France, in Sweden, and elsewhere, addressed their citizens in measured terms, treating them as adults. And the level of fear in those countries was significantly lower. It is not fair to criticise the government of the United Kingdom for the mere fact that the death toll in Britain is the second highest in Europe. There are too many factors other than government action which determine the mortality of COVID-19. But it is fair to blame them for the fear which has meant that Britain seems likely to suffer greater economic damage than almost every other European country. The ease with which people could be terrorized into surrendering basic freedoms which are fundamental to our existence as social beings came as a shock to me in March of this year. So has much of the subsequent debate. I certainly never expected to hear the word libertarian, which only means a believer in freedom, used as a term of abuse. Perhaps I should have done, because this isn't a new problem. 4 centuries ago, the political theorist Thomas Hobbes formulated his notorious apology for absolute government. The basis of human society, Hobbes argued, is that people have no right to be free because they completely and irrevocably surrender their liberty to an overpowering state in return for security. In an age obsessed with escaping from risk, this has become one of the major issues of our time. Now, I have criticised the way in which the government has invaded civil liberties, with limited parliamentary scrutiny or none. But of course, parliamentary scrutiny is not enough unless Parliament itself is willing to live up to its high constitutional calling. It has to be ready to demand rational explanations of ministerial actions.
So the cases in the hospital, there's 3 people in Trelisk Hospital with COVID. That was on Friday. Okay, and do lots of you know that the flu and COVID cases are now combined as the same thing? Okay, if you died with COVID within 28 days, that goes on your death certificate. You might all realise as well that the flu numbers, they've gone right down. Where have they gone?